Hello everyone, I'll start again. So I was saying that the the topic of today's satsang, at least the beginning of it, came into existence just 30 seconds ago.
2 minutes ago.
2 minutes ago. And that's the topic of free will. And why it's a great topic is that we, if we're familiar with the teaching, would have heard that the teaching often puts forward the concept that all of life is a predetermined story, a creation that unfolds in each moment exactly as it's destined to unfold. Ramesh used to say that the movie is in the can. It has been written, acted, directed, produced, and it's in the can. Now, we have to be careful when relating to teachings not to just believe what is said. The teachings are a set of concepts, a set of pointers that are there to point at something that we haven't seen, to point at life in a way that becomes useful such that it affects the deeply ingrained false beliefs that exist. And when those false beliefs are highlighted, when the false beliefs become weakened, then a different way of functioning happens. So the notion that life is predetermined, completely unfolding according to God's will, so we can say life is a happening that happens according to God's will. This is particularly relevant because it starts to undermine the deeply ingrained belief that is put in place by life, the deeply ingrained belief of personal doership. And many of you will know that the emphasis on these talks is on this belief of personal doership, which has a subcategory underneath it of attachment to outcome. So what is called doership includes the belief I am the doer, the other is the doer, and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, meaning I have an attachment to what I think will give me happiness, what will complete me. So this personal doership belief is a way of seeing whatever happens through the body. It's an attitude, it's a way of relating to whatever happens through the body as my doing. So it's an interpretation of what happens and how it happened. The interpretation is seeing that the thoughts, the actions, behaviors, feelings of the body, how the body performs and behaves in life, is dictated by me. I'm the one that is in control of whatever happens through me. Now, the concept that says life is a predetermined story, a creation of source, it goes a little further. It's source has become the story. Source has become the creation. Source is not separate from it and creating it, but has become the creation. So this notion that life is a creation predetermined to unfold exactly as it unfolds, and so Ramesh used to say that, I don't know if I've already said this bit or I said it when the microphone was off, but Ramesh used to say, the movie is in the can. The story has been written, acted, directed, produced, and it's in the can. So this notion that life is predetermined and unfolding in each moment exactly as it's destined to unfold essentially butts head with the belief in personal doership, which says what I say, what I think, how I act is not dictated to by anyone other than me. That's what the belief in personal doership, that's how the belief in personal doership interprets what happens. And so the belief in personal doership interprets what the other is doing in the same way as their doing, meaning they are the orchestrator. They are the one that has chosen, independent of anything else, as a volitional, independent entity, to do what they do, to think what they think, to feel what they feel, according to their own free will, their own choice. Now, the idea that life is a happening according to God's will sort of implies something very different. It implies that each of us will feel and act and think and speak, not according to my will, but according to the will of the story, according to the predetermined creation. And so the pointer, the teaching, is here. It says, life is not what it seems. Life on the surface appears to be an objective reality, whereas when seen from a different perspective, we'll see that life is much different to what it seems on the surface. And one of the things that appears to be the case is that we are all separate, independent entities, meaning doers, the only ones that decide, and that on the surface it appears I decide because of, well, not because of factors outside of my control, but completely because of my control. And the pointers are saying, well, it's not quite as it seems. So in the Vedic scriptures, this is referred to as Leela, the play of consciousness, or Maya, the illusion of life, or the confusion of life. So here we're being delivered pointers, teachings, to which act as new conditioning that come into our system, and then we start thinking about it, and that thinking is also part of the story of life. So in these teachings, we'll say whatever happens is predetermined according to God's will, or the predetermined story of life, or we can say predetermined to unfold according to your makeup, which is based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Up-to-date conditioning means the combination, the accumulation of all of the new conditioning that is continually coming into our system, moment after moment after moment. So a spiritual teaching throws out the notion, life is not what it seems. We are not as separate as we think. Life is a predetermined story, a creation, according to source. All there is consciousness. All there is Brahman. Brahman is everything. Brahman meaning God, or energy, or source. And so we hear that, that's new conditioning, and then some thinking happens, some contemplating, according to our makeup and the new information that has come into the system. And that thinking might revolve around, this topic. Well, is life really out of my control? Is life really happening according to some bigger scheme? Or am I the one that is choosing what to do in each moment? And so the topic of free will is worth investigating. Now, when I first went to see Ramesh, I had no question about whether life was predetermined or not. In fact, long before listening to his teachings and before I went to see him, I hadn't listened to his teachings. It had become clear that actually life seems to be much more magnificent than we sometimes give it credit for, much more magnificent than I've given it credit for at that time. And I had started to see the synchronicity, the intricacy of life, and started to observe that things were happening in a way that led me to conclude that some higher force was behind all of this, that it wasn't as random as it seemed, especially when the seeking process started to happen. The seeking process started to unfold in a very magical way, where exactly the right dose of new information would come in, supported by exactly the required circumstances, supported by exactly the right thinking. And the outcome of this mix would deliver insights that clearly were not my doing. And as I saw this, it became apparent that the whole thing is an orchestration, like a symphony, that I wasn't putting in place. And it also became clear that if I had to figure this out, I'd mess it up very quickly. And so when I went and I listened to Ramesh, I agreed, yes, life is completely predetermined. And he would explain that the actions that happen through each of us in each moment, the thoughts, are based on these two factors, our genes and up-to-date conditioning, that I wasn't in control of. I was born to a family that I didn't choose, in a country I didn't choose. I went to a school that I didn't choose. I met friends that were at that school and I didn't choose who was going to be at the school. I was born into a country that had a certain political culture and religious culture. The specifics of my family were very specific. And so from the moment of conception, there was a genetic structure, and then once we were born, we are impacted by life, conditioned by all of these factors, our parents, our friends, our school, religion. And how we're impacted by that is not in our control. What information society delivers to me, telling me what I should and shouldn't do, what's important, not in my control. And so then the decisions that I make in each moment, I find are based on who I am in a particular moment, based on my genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors I wasn't in control of, and furthermore, the specifics of the situation I find myself in. Whether there's a barking dog or whether there's a grumpy cash attendant or a very excited brother or sister, and I find myself in a circumstance that I'm not in control of, and I find myself reacting or responding, functioning in life. Seems very much like my doing, but on close investigation, I find that if I was different, if the circumstance was different, then the response, the reaction, the functioning would be different. So this very clear to me. And at some point, Ramesh said, but we have complete free will in the moment to do exactly what we think or feel to do. And I couldn't quite sit with that. I thought, hang on a sec. Everything is completely predetermined, unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. I'm functioning in each moment according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning I wasn't in control of. I'm with you on this note. And then you throw in the notion that we have complete free will in the moment to do exactly what we think or feel to do. And my brain could only see these as contradictions. So I said, we have apparent free will. I said, no, you actually have free will in each moment to do whatever you think or feel to do. And what he was pointing at is that even though life is a predetermined story, that how that story unfolds in each moment is through the actions of the individual. Now, he wasn't saying that the actions of the individual are my doing. The actions of the individual are still part of the story of life. And yet, we can't deny that once we've seen that the mechanics are out of my control, that both in theory and in practice, I'm not in control. In theory, whatever I choose is based on these two factors, genes and up-to-date conditioning, that I'm not in control of. And in practice, once I've made a decision, the outcome, not in my control. So I can place an order at a restaurant, and it becomes very clear that what I choose is determined by the circumstance I find myself in, which is a particular menu is given to me with a set of options. I will look at the options, and based on my biological preferences and my up-to-date conditioning, which might include certain information from society that says I should and shouldn't eat these things. So whatever my makeup is will get me to one option will be chosen. So that's how life unfolds. And then once the option is chosen, I place the order. And after I've placed the order, I say, I'll have an orange juice, please. The waiter comes back either with my orange juice, or he says, I'm very sorry, but there was no orange juice in the kitchen, so you can't have your orange juice. Sometimes I get what I want. Sometimes I don't get what I want. Ramesh used to add, and sometimes we get much more than we want. The waiter might come back and say, here's your orange juice, and it's on the house. Correct? So this demonstrates that our choice is based on factors not in our control, and in practice, what we get, the outcome, not in my control. Now, you might have heard that I use the word choice. Often when we hear that everything is predetermined, when we come to see that what happens in each moment is dictated to by factors that I didn't control, that even thoughts that arise are not my creation, and that a thought is what precedes actions, what precedes behavior, then if we see that thoughts just arise in a particular moment and drive an action, and that I'm not in control of the thought that arises, then it becomes more and more evident that I'm not the chooser, that I'm not in control, that life is happening. And so we often then have trouble using the word choice. We say, I have no choice. And this is the point that I'm making here, is that we also have to start seeing the experience as it really is. That's the whole point. So the pointers are pointing to seeing life as it is, or at least in a way that we haven't seen before. And so the notion that everything is predetermined gets us to hopefully investigate, to observe, to become interested in life. And it's emphasized here, don't believe anything that's said. Use the concepts, the pointers, to take a look for yourself and see whether you agree or disagree with what's being suggested. So we investigate this point of personal doership. We find out that I'm not the doer, and so then we might have trouble saying, it's my choice. It would make sense. We stop saying it's my choice. Sometimes we go a little further and say there is no choice. But let's look at how life unfolds, how the predetermined story of life unfolds, is still through each of us doing in each moment what we think or feel to do. Now, I'm not saying that we generate that thought or feeling. The thought or feeling is part of the predetermined story, and yet in practice, the choice still happens through me. And what I mean by the choice, because if we see everything as predetermined, we can have trouble using the word choice. Once again, there is no choice, but that's because there's a specific definition that we have attributed to choice, the word choice. In life, most verbs are assumed to be their doing words, and so it's assumed in life that I am the doer. So if we use the word choice, the presupposition is that it is my choice. So if we see that the choosing, the unfolding of life is not my doing, we can sometimes say, well, there is no choice. There is choice. A menu was presented to us. The menu had 10 items on it, 10 options. And at some point, one of the options was picked. So the picking of one of many options is the dynamic of choice. We'll have an issue reconciling this if we keep insisting that the word choice only means the choice of my doing, where I am the doer. Then we won't be able to use the word choice. We'll keep insisting, I've seen clearly that there is no choice. And really when we insist this, it's because we haven't seen clearly the full unfolding of life. So what we've seen clearly is that the entity that I previously thought was doing the choosing is much more forced into picking something specific rather than a choice from what we used to know as free will, my free will. So we won't be able to reconcile anymore the word choice. But if we redefine the word choice and say, actually choice means the simple act of one of many options being picked. That's what we will call choice. And so the way that life unfolds, the way that the predetermined story of life unfolds, is through the individual choosing one of several options. Let's understand that that choice is not their doing, is based on their genes and up-to-date conditioning. And yet, it would be inaccurate to say that there is no choice in life. And furthermore, the word free will is something that we will have trouble using once we see that all of life is predetermined. And that's because we have a specific definition of free will. That definition of free will is linked to my choice and my control. And so if we see that actually we're not in control in life and the choices that happen are not my doing, then using the word free will becomes hard for us too. That's because it has a specific definition. If we can change the definition of free will in our head, just meaning how we relate to the word, and see that the word free will, in the context I'm using it, and in the context that Ramesh used it when he said, in each moment we have the complete free will to do whatever we think or feel to do. What he was meaning is that even though life is predetermined, the experience is that I am free in each moment to move my hand to the right, to move my hand to the left, to stand up, to sit down, to eat, to pick whatever is on the table in terms of food options. And so what he's talking about is that free will is a feeling of free will. The undeniable feeling that I am free in each moment to do exactly what I think or feel to do. And if we say there is no free will, there is no choice, what's happened is we've recognized that life functions differently to what we had thought, but we're then not observing the experience as it presents. And the experience as it presents is very much that I have the feeling of free will. And frankly, that feeling of free will is a gift within the experience of life. If someone prayed for the feeling of free will to be taken away from them because they realize that so much of my suffering comes from the belief in personal doership. So much of my suffering comes when I relate to myself as the doer and relate to the others as the doer, and therefore I blame the others, I feel pride and I feel guilt. If we realize that so much of the suffering in life is based on this belief in personal doership, and we mistakenly pray for something just a little bit off center, if we pray for the removal of the feeling of free will, please God, I want you to take away the feeling of free will so that I don't suffer anymore. What we're doing is asking for God to take away something that's actually a gift, not the problem. So the feeling of free will is something that remains after liberation, whereby we still feel like I am free in each moment to do exactly what I think or feel to do. I don't feel like I am a slave to God's will. I don't feel like I'm a puppet at the end of the string being dictated to. I understand in theory that this is the case. I understand that whatever happens through me is not my doing. But the feeling of free will, thankfully, after this deep recognition happens, remains. And so if we prayed to God, please God, take my feeling of free will away so that my suffering ends, what we'll end up with is a very different experience of life, one that feels very unfree. The real problem is the belief in personal doership, not the feeling of free will. Why is the belief in personal doership there? The belief in personal doership is there because from a young age this feeling of free will got put in place. And because the feeling of free will was there, it meant that life was experienced as if I have free will. That was the experience. And because that was the experience, then the belief was put in place because it interpreted the experience. Makes sense. I feel like I have free will, therefore the belief gets put in place that says, I have free will. So the belief that I have free will as a separate independent entity is the belief in personal doership. It got put in place because of the way the experience is designed to feel. And it gets removed, not by the feeling of free will being removed, but rather by us seeing deeper than the surface, seeing behind the feeling and seeing the actual dynamics at play. So when we see the dynamics at play, we realize, what happens in each moment is dictated to by a force that is much greater than me as a separate independent entity. In fact, there's the recognition that I as a separate independent entity don't exist. What I exist as is an entity that is always affected by what came before. So really my actions and my thoughts, my feelings, are completely predetermined by factors that came before. So a deep recognition of this starts to undermine the belief in personal doership. That belief in personal doership starts getting uprooted as we no longer believe the belief to be as true as we used to. The feeling of free will remains. Someone might mistake the dissolving of the belief in doership if they see that the belief in doership for themselves is dissolving, they might still insist, I don't have the feeling of free will. I now feel like I'm being lived. I'd agree. But when we really go down to the experience, it's undeniable that in each moment I do feel like I am free to pick this or this. And the feeling doesn't feel like I am being dictated to by. The understanding clearly sees the dynamics, but the feeling is of free will. And if we're waiting for the feeling of free will to one day dissolve, we'll be waiting a long time, because life is not designed to be experienced without the sense of free will, without the feeling of free will. Life is, at best, designed to unfold such that the individual deeply, deeply realizes that whatever they do is a result of consciousness functioning through them, is a result of the predetermined story of life unfolding, is a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning that they had no control over. And that deep recognition will result in the end of suffering. And so life is designed to be, at some point for some people, experienced in a way where suffering falls away. However, it's not designed for life to be lived on a continuous basis without the sense of free will. Not designed to be lived on a continuous basis, feeling like there is no person. Those experiences for short or extended periods of time where the person falls away, or where we feel completely moved without the sense of free will, happen. And when they happen, we assume that to be enlightenment because of the awakening teachings that have brought that shift about. And when that fades away, we assume that our enlightenment came, it's faded away, and at some point it will come back and remain on a continuous, unbroken basis. And we wait for this to happen. We wait for something that, according to what I'm putting forward, is not what enlightened living actually looks like. That was an awakening to show us something, a sort of behind-the-scenes tour, to show us that actually the fundamental nature of life is very different to what it seems on the surface. And once we've had that behind-the-scenes tour, once we've been given that experience, been given that information experientially, life then shifts back and says, yes, but life is not meant to be lived in that state. Life is meant to be lived as the human being, functioning as if you have free will, as if you are the person, feeling as if you have free will, feeling as if you are the person, but now with the deeply ingrained understanding that has dissolved the previously deeply ingrained belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes. So what we end up with is a human being, or the ego. So we can call the human being the ego. The ego doesn't dissolve. We are the ego. What ends up happening is that there is an ego that at first had the belief in personal doership, went through a process where the ego started to see, according to destiny, that the belief in doership is not as accurate as we might have believed. The ego at that point even starts to believe that they don't exist and overlooks their own existence for a period of time. This is the part of the process that is referred to as, and during the process of enlightenment, mountains and rivers were seen to be unreal. The person was seen to be unreal. But then the next phase is where mountains and rivers are seen to be real again. So we come back and we realize, oh, the ego is here. The ego is not the problem. The ego is the person, and the person doesn't go anywhere. What dissolves is the belief in personal doership. So we had an ego with the belief in personal doership, and after liberation or enlightenment, there is an ego without the belief in personal doership, still experiencing themselves as if they are the person and experiencing themselves as if they have complete free will. Something that I reiterate is a gift and not the problem. The problem is the belief that got put in place when that feeling was believed and experienced to be absolutely true and a reflection of truth. Now we're understanding that this feeling of free will is part of the experience of life. And experience is exactly that. It's a creation. It is what is referred to as the predetermined story of life, the creation of life. So the experience includes in it the feeling of free will. The reconciliation is quite a beautiful one. When we come to it, we come to see that my free will is actually never different to God's will. That all of life is unfolding according to God's will, and how life unfolds in each moment is through the actions of the individual, which is also God's will. Those actions are based on my feeling of free will to do whatever I think or feel to do next, which means I can then conclude that God's will and my feeling of free will are not two. So my separation from God falls away, and I realize that in each moment I'm always connected to Source, that what the human being is actually the impersonal consciousness of Source that has linked to a particular body-mind organism, a vehicle, and is functioning through that vehicle as personal consciousness, the experience that you are having right now, an experience of life from a very particular perspective, the perspective of the individual. So I'll repeat, the human being is the impersonal consciousness of Source that links to a particular body-mind organism and is functioning through that body-mind organism as personal consciousness. So each of us are having a unique personal consciousness experience. Ollie's personal consciousness experience, Erica's personal consciousness experience, Andrea's, Roger's, all a unique personal consciousness experience that is a result of the one undifferentiated consciousness of Source functioning through many differentiated vehicles. So we can look at this as the one undifferentiated electricity that functions through many different appliances. Each appliance is a vehicle for the electricity to function through, and the appliance is unique, is designed to be a particular way and different from another appliance. So we have heaters and we have fans and we have air conditioners and fridges, and the one undifferentiated electricity functions through all the appliances and produces a unique output. Heat from the heater, movement from the fan, cold from the fridge. All outputs produced exactly according to the makeup of the vehicle that the one undifferentiated electricity functions through. The human being can be seen as, well, the body can be seen as this vehicle, and at some point dinosaurs were on this earth and they were the most complex vehicle that consciousness had to function through. So at some point consciousness was having an experience through the dinosaurs, experiencing the world from the perspective of many different dinosaurs. And now consciousness is experiencing it through humans, a much more complex vehicle. So what we know as our personal consciousness experience is actually not separate from the experience that consciousness of Source is having. So consciousness of Source doesn't experience the world from out there somewhere, doesn't experience the world from, like, as though they're behind some control module of a whole lot of CCTV cameras. Consciousness is having the experience that each of us is having right now, not separate from the experience we're having right now, or not a duplicate of the experience that we're having right now, but the very experience you're having right now is the experience that consciousness is having. You and consciousness are not two. The recognition of my hand is the experience right now, part of the experience right now. that is the experience that we can call your personal consciousness experience. If a bird chirps, that is part of the experience, and it's the personal consciousness experience. It's the experience of a bird chirping from the perspective of this particular body-mind organism. And we might come to see that, oh, that is the experience that consciousness is having. This is why we hear that God and I are not two. God or consciousness is functioning through all of us. And so for as long as we have this notion that God is out there and that I need to one day find God, I need to understand God, that very notion is keeping us from seeing, from knowing God here and now. It's a notion that says, well, I don't know this God, I don't know where this God is, but maybe if I'm lucky, if grace lands on me, then I will come to know God. It's there because the simple recognition that what God is the consciousness functioning through all of us right now. That's how close God is.
How can I know, thanks to your teaching, that this electricity, to take your metaphor, which is creating and living into this body, it's the same than the electricity which appears in the holy body or in the... How can I know that? There is a... Because I know that I know the awareness, but how, thanks to your teaching, I can know that this awareness is the same, that we are sharing, all of us? This is the first question. And the second question, I think one time you told us that we can't know that this awareness and sense of being, we cannot have any experience of the consciousness. But I think this is a higher layer. I think the first layer is, how can I know that my awareness is unlimited, thanks to your teaching?
Is unlimited?
Yes. And it's impersonal. That means we are all sharing the same awareness.
Mm-hmm. So remember, these are pointers,
Yes.
concepts, not truth. Don't take a concept for truth. That's what humans have been doing for thousands of years, mistaking the relative as something absolute.
But how can I use this concept to have the experience of at least the recognition that my awareness, to get to the point to say, at least it's not my awareness. Maybe I don't know what awareness is, but can I get, thanks to your teaching, to the point to say, I have to recognize that I cannot continue to affirm that this is my awareness. You understand my question?
Well, it is your awareness.
But not mine on the sense of limited to this body-mind.
That's not important. Actually, we think that that's important. What's important is to be aware of our awareness. So let me go back to what I was saying about the concepts, because I'll answer the question with first putting this this reminder there that the concepts are pointing to something. They are not truth. We've been mistaking relative. Now, relative, let me just also throw in something about this word relative. We sometimes mean that when we say something is relative, we say, well, I can see it from my point of view, and therefore it is relative. That from another point of view, it's going to be seen to be different. Or relative means that something is hot relative to cooler water, let's say, but compared to much, much hotter water, it's not very hot at all. So this is what relative means, and it's a good use of the word relative. It plays into this topic of not holding something absolutely. But the way I use the word relative, which is really important is not only relative to something else, but to mean that anything that is perceived, anything that is thought, is not absolute, not only because of it being relative compared to something else, but because the instrument that produces the thought, or that the perception happens through, like the brain or the eyes, is in itself a limited instrument. It isn't an absolute instrument. It has limitations. So the eyes are limited based on their design. You can have human eyes that are not as good as someone else's human eyes. And so the reason for me saying that someone's eyes are not as good as someone else's eyes, and then someone with very good eyesight has very limited vision compared to, let's say, some X-ray vision machine or some magnifying glass that can see much more detail. The reason is to show that the perception or the thought is dictated to by a limited machine, that no matter how good it gets, it's always limited by some factors. So the thinking that we have, the thinking produced by the brain, is limited. And that's what I mean by relative. It's not absolute. So we can look at a situation and we can have information about the situation and we can draw a conclusion. We have to understand that the information we have is limited. Even if we have a lot of information, it's limited by our perception, it's limited by the source that we get the information through, which is the source is limited by their capacity to see the situation completely, and no limited entity can see the situation absolutely. We can only see it in a limited way. And so humans have been taking things that are by their very nature limited and taking them as absolute for a long time, which is why we don't know ourselves, because we believe ourselves to be something, because certain concepts, certain ways of interpreting life have been taken to be absolute. I see it this way, so this is the way it is. And therefore, we become very limited in our experience of life because of the fact of taking something that is relative as absolute. So the pointers here are exactly that. They're concepts, they're pointers, they're not truths. The only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. So that's a pointer in the teaching, and it's there for a very important reason. Don't take the concepts as truth. And then it goes on to say, the only truth in the manifestation is the impersonal sense of I am. It says that for good reason. It means that the concepts, the pointers are all pointing to this I am. The only truth in the manifestation. That doesn't actually look at the words in particular, the only truth in the manifestation. It's not saying this is ultimate truth. It's not saying this is absolute. It's saying that for as long as our experience of the manifestation is here, meaning daily living, the impersonal sense of I am is always present. It's a constant. Now, I still haven't answered the question, so I'll carry on doing that. In another path, in a different teaching will say the consciousness that functions through you is an individual consciousness. In various forms of Buddhism, they will say it's an individual consciousness. Advaita says the consciousness is the consciousness of Source. It's a concept. Because it gets delivered to us in a certain form, where we have become sort of mesmerized in a sense, taking teachings as truth, we hear this concept that it is the consciousness of Source, and we take it as truth. And then you'll have Advaitins fighting the Buddhists, right? Or Dzogchen, that maybe uses a different pointer, arguing with the Advaitins. So the Buddhists will say, it's not a universal consciousness, it's an individual consciousness. And the Advaitins will say, you just haven't seen what I've seen. I've awoken to the fact it's a universal consciousness. The Buddhists will say, I've awoken to consciousness, but it's an individual consciousness. And what they're arguing over is labels that got handed down by the teachings that were very useful at bringing about shifts, but then the recognition that the teaching itself is not truth, but is pointing at truth. And when we look at it from the point of view of the Buddhist, who is seeing it as an individual consciousness, we can't argue with them. Can we prove that this is a universal consciousness? If you go to your own experience, all you have is your own experience. And we might be guided by some concepts that say, believe me, what you're experiencing is the consciousness of Source. What you're experiencing, that when someone awakens to the consciousness, is the consciousness, the universal consciousness, the one consciousness. And we can then very easily interpret the experience according to the teachings that we came through. Instead of actually saying it's not important whether it's a universal consciousness or an individual consciousness. Our happiness is not to know the workings of the universe. Our happiness stems from the recognition I am. I exist in this moment. Still haven't finished answering the question. So if the teachings are pointing at a recognition of I am, that's where our happiness comes from, the recognition that what I am in this moment that has been recognized, regardless of whether it is a individual consciousness or a universal consciousness, not important. The teachings that came before would say it's very important in order to allow attention to focus on that, in order for the awakening to happen. That's their job, to get the awakening to happen. We then have to, at some point, drop the teachings, which have become embedded, like that second thorn that was used to remove the first thorn, and realize which concepts are important and which concepts were just doing a job. So, is it important to know that is a universal consciousness or an individual consciousness? I say no, it's not. I say that after having put forward a concept that says the human being is a result of the impersonal consciousness of Source functioning through a particular body-mind as personal consciousness. That concept is there to bring attention, to focus attention inward onto the consciousness that is functioning through the body-mind organism. And it's giving it a context. It's giving the mind something to imagine in order for eventually awareness to land on that which is here. And when it sees it's here, whether it comes from Source or whether it comes from the body, whether it is the same consciousness that functions through everyone or just the consciousness functioning through me, largely is irrelevant. Because the recognition of this, when that recognition completely dissolves the belief in personal doership, completely dissolves the suffering that can still be in the system after the initial realization. Once the realization has dissolved the beliefs and there is the awareness of my existence, then that's enough. That ends up being our happiness, that the realization that I am living life as the human without all of the questions I had in the past. Not because I got a whole lot of answers, but simply because my questions in the past were arising out of my disconnection from who I am. And that disconnection from who I am creates an uncomfortableness. That uncomfortableness creates all the questions. And this realization of who I am, which at first might be realized and labeled as a universal consciousness, that's fine. That realization eventually undoes the belief in personal doership, undoes the attachment to outcomes, which means it undoes this suffering and the questions fall away. So, let's go on and say, when you said, how can I know that the consciousness that is functioning through me is the same consciousness functioning through the others? Ultimately, all we can ever know is that I am conscious. The knowing that the other is conscious is just an assumption. I can never know whether someone else is conscious. For all I know, everyone in front of me is an android that has no consciousness functioning through them, and that you are all specifically designed and programmed to answer a particular way, to affirm that, sure, you have consciousness. So I ask you, are you conscious? And you'll nod your head and say, yes, I'm conscious. I can see exactly what you can see. And we can't know that to be true. This doesn't mean we'll go around assuming the other person doesn't have consciousness. In fact, we do live assuming that the other person has consciousness just like I have consciousness. So the important part is to become very familiar with the human experience. And in becoming intimately familiar with the human experience, which inevitably means we have to become familiar with the awareness aspect, because you can't have experience without awareness. And when we become intimately familiar with the awareness aspect, we realize that with it, there is this undeniable sense, I am, I exist, isness, amness, being. And as the investigation of our own experience gets more and more refined, we start to see that from one perspective, we can see that the personality has nothing to do with consciousness. The body characteristics have nothing to do with consciousness. The thinking has nothing to do with consciousness. That all of those are essentially dictated to and products of the body-mind organism, the vehicle. And the consciousness is functioning through the vehicle and experiencing the experience, or experiencing oneself as a complete package of both consciousness and all of the characteristics of the vehicle. The preferences, the sense of touch and sound and taste. And so life is experienced as if I am the human, which is the combination of the consciousness and the body-mind vehicle. So as we investigate the nature of experience in meditation, and more of the personal daily life experiences fall away in meditation, we become familiar with the essence of life experience. The essence of life experience is the awareness and the sense of existence. And so what we are very used to experiencing, the individual consciousness, starts to be peeled away. Layers start to be peeled away. And what we find at the core is an impersonal consciousness that has no characteristics. An impersonal consciousness that does no thinking, doesn't have preferences, doesn't have a body, doesn't have a sex, doesn't have an age. If we remain really present with, and what I mean by we remain really present, if that consciousness itself becomes really present of itself in a meditation, we see the most basic form of manifestation is awareness and the sense of existence. And then as the layers of daily life come back in, as we come out of meditation, what a large part of the layers coming back are the body and the thoughts, the emotions, the feelings, the personality, the preferences. And we realize, the human being is a layering of all of these objects of experience onto a core essence, awareness and the sense of existence. And when that awareness and sense of existence are aware of itself without all of that, what's really clear is there is no gender, there is no age. All of these characteristics are all part of the layering on top. And so then we say, I've come to see, I've come to know myself as a human being, as a human experience. I have to live as that human experience. Life will continue to unfold with the human experience there. And so then once I know the principle, the fundamental nature of the human, then I can say, all other humans are in nature the same. All other humans in nature, assuming that they are conscious, like my experience of myself being conscious, assuming they are conscious, then the consciousness is the same impersonal consciousness in its essence. Awareness and the basic sense of existence, no age, no gender, no personality, no preferences, no thoughts. All of that is what comes in after and makes them a unique person on the outside, on the expression. The core is the same consciousness. Now, is it the same one consciousness, or is it that we all have an individual consciousness that happens to be the same in nature? The fact is, it doesn't really matter again. It would matter if our happiness came from recognizing the one universal consciousness as one universal consciousness. If that was where our happiness comes from, then it would become important for me to say, but I need to know whether this is a universal consciousness or an individual consciousness. The fact is, our happiness comes from the falling away of the belief in doership and attachment to outcome, meaning the falling away of suffering, and the simultaneous recognition of one's own essence, one's own existence, irrelevant of, this is what we come to see when it happens, is actually, I don't need to know anything more than I exist. I exist plus the diminishing of the belief in doership and attachment to outcome. That is what the spiritual process is. So whatever anyone who says they are free of suffering or enlightened, they might not even use those words because the intellect in that particular person may not have been focused on what has actually changed. But if someone is free of suffering, they've gone through a process whereby the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome has been diminished through one process or another. The methodology could have been through some profound awakening experience. The saving grace is not the awakening experience, but what that awakening experience then allows to happen. It allows the undermining of the belief in doership and attachment to outcome to happen. Allows that to happen. And then when that load of suffering, that load which is a false idea of who I am, dissolves, the existence, the awareness that I could say is my awareness, Roger's awareness, Roger's existence, presents itself and is self-contenting, is self-confirming. Doesn't require any more knowing of it than it is, I am. You can ask.
No more question. Thank you. It was very, very clear, very helpful. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you a lot.
It's difficult to hear, to accept that the free will is a gift. And you say also it's an illusion. So both, it's difficult to put both together.
Yeah, this is great because we've been conditioned to think that illusion is the problem. We've been conditioned to think we're looking for truth. Life is never going to is never going to reveal truth. The closest thing to truth that life will deliver us is this sense of I am, which is more than enough. The reason that we'll never be able to know truth, what we'll be able to know is errors that we had of thought. In hindsight, we'll go, I was wrong about that. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about that. And along the way, we'll think, I thought that was truth once, and now I realize I was wrong about that being truth. And now I know what truth is. So we see that something is wrong, or something is an error that we had believed, and as a result of that falling away, a new experience happens. That's what happens when we let go of a belief, when a belief dissolves. The world is seen, now I get it. And we believe this is truth. I get it. I see it. This is revealed. Now I see reality. And that's another mistake, that at some point we'll look at it and go, and I was wrong there. I thought that reality was revealed, that when the veil of separation fell away, when the oneness presented, that was truth, that was reality, that was the absolute, because I was no longer seeing it through the veil of thought. This is what we've been told. And I have nothing against those teachings. I actually deliver those teachings from time to time. They're a methodology. The process is a methodology. So I've got nothing against the teaching. What I'm highlighting here is how, as a seeker, we tend to go through phases where we believe that we have found truth, we have touched onto the absolute, and that belief is supported by the teachings that make some claims that have to be made in order for certain shifts to happen. And one of those claims is that we experience illusion, and that illusion keeps us away from truth. And what also supports this is the notion that we are looking for truth. Actually, we're looking for happiness. What I mean is that life, we're never going to know truth, because all we ever have is our experience of life. Even what appears to be what a teaching has told us is not experience, but non-experience, the falling away of experience. Even that is experience. It's so crucial for us at some point to go past the notion that now I experience reality. Or we can drop the word experience reality. Now I know reality. We don't ever know reality. What has happened is now there is an experience free of certain objects that used to be in the old experience. Now there is experience free of certain thinking. And we assume that when we are experiencing without thinking, that suddenly, magically, this is now not experience, but it's truth. And it's still experience. Any experience of daily life, or for that matter, samadhi or meditation, that has been had in the history of time is an experience. And that means that a teacher, an enlightened being, has only ever had experience of life. And what is revealed in experience is part of the experience. Now, I agree that what is revealed in certain experiences seems to be truth. The experience is designed to feel like this is truth. But actually it's an experience of life, and we will never be able to know truth. We will only ever be able to know experience. So I didn't answer the question yet, which is the question of how free will is a gift, and how it's hard to reconcile that it's a gift when I said it was an illusion. So what my point is that we're not looking for truth. We're not looking for the end of experience. All we'll ever have is experience. And experience really means what it appears. Now, what it appears like, even when it shifts from appearing like one thing to appearing like the other, that what it appears like as in the other, the where we see, oh, this is reality, that's an experience, not truth. So that's an illusion too. So illusion isn't the problem. It's where we're lost in the illusion that it's the problem. Where the illusion covers up the sense of I, the part of the experience that, when revealed, makes the experience an experience that we have no problem with. No problem, because the aspect of the experience, the I, is designed such that it's enough for the experience to then be designed in such a way that there's no problem. So the feeling of free will is just part of the experience. We feel free. When I say it's not truth, it means that if we investigate the experience deeper, we'll see that the experience is designed to have several layers. It shows us that on the one hand, we are free, and on a deeper investigation of the experience on a causal basis, we find that what we think is our freedom is a biological movement that is dictated to be a movement according to factors that we're not in control of. And that the outcome is an outcome that we're not in control of. So we see that the experience is designed to have two dimensions to it. The surface and what is implied below the surface. What is implied below the surface in itself is not truth. It's just what we come to see is implied in the experience, which means when we see it, it's part of the experience, that layer of the experience of life is seen. And when that deeper layer is seen, the belief in personal doership is affected. The belief in personal doership, which is part of the experience, falls away. So this is all a magnificent story unfolding, step by step, paragraph after paragraph, page after page, chapter after chapter. And it's an unfolding that is designed to unfold as if it's a story of cause and effect. So the experience is designed at first to just be experienced on the surface and taken to be truth. At some point, as part of the experience, spiritual teachings start coming in, and we find that there's an interest in spiritual teachings. And then the teachings start pointing at a deeper layer of the experience. And because it's a story of cause and effect, once a teaching comes into the experience and points at a deeper layer, awareness, which is simply the experience, changes such that the deeper layer then is part of the experience. When the deeper layer is seen, it has an effect, and the effect is that it changes the beliefs in the experience. And eventually, the experience ends up being something in particular, not truth, still an experience. Now, I know that people will be listening to this, having had awakenings, and they will be convinced, oh, he doesn't know what he's saying because he hasn't had this experience. He doesn't, which they won't be calling an experience. From where the person's experience is at the moment, I know from my own experience that the experience is designed to feel, especially because of the teachings that came before, designed to feel and to be interpreted as truth. And I was in the same position when I went to Ramesh, and I was talking about life as if some absolute truth can be known, as if reality can be known, unable to hear what he was saying when he was telling me what I'm sharing, until at some point it clicked, and it became clear to me that just because the experience feels like oneness, just because an aspect of the experience, which we call awareness or consciousness or the sense of I, is revealed, which really means that the experience changes such that it includes those elements in it, doesn't mean that that's reality. It doesn't mean that because it feels like oneness that I now say it's not an experience, this is truth. I say that when I've been conditioned that says, with teachings or with concepts that say experience is subject-object relationship. And what you're looking for is reality, which is covered up by subject-object relationship. And if you stop thinking, if you stop believing the stories, and you just live life for long enough by just observing what is, without labeling, you will see life from a perspective where the subject-object relationship falls away, and that is knowing, that is truth, that is reality. And so we have all of that conditioning that says what experience is and what truth is. And because we're resonating with these teachings, we start to look at life day after day, hour after hour, without labeling. And the subject-object relationship does fall away. The teachings are doing their job, and the experience changes. And what's revealed is a new experience which is not seen to be experience, but is interpreted now to be truth. Ah, this is truth. And so if someone is in that space of being aware without thinking, there is a belief in place that this is now not experience. This is truth. And when it clicked to me, it's just a oneness experience. It's just an experience that is designed to no longer have the same characteristics as the previous experience. It's not truth. If there is truth, right, it's the absence of experience, which means the absence of daily living, the absence of meditation, the absence of dream, the absence of oneness. It's the complete subsiding into nothing. Not that we can experience, but it's the equivalent of, let's say, deep sleep, where consciousness isn't even aware of itself. Absolute nothing. So if I was to concede to a truth, it would be that truth which not even God will know. It is source at rest, not even aware of itself. Everything else is that potentiality exploded into manifestation, where there is awareness, either awareness of subject-object relationship or awareness of oneness. It's not so important. That's just experience. So my point is, we're not looking for truth. And so why you said it's hard to reconcile that the feeling of free will is a gift, and yet I say it's an illusion, is because we have this deeply ingrained belief that we are looking for truth. And illusion is taken to be the opposite of truth.
Seems to be completely mad. Seems to be completely mad. I don't understand the utility of all that.
The utility or the use, right, is the usefulness of all of this is for our attention to start landing on what is important for it to land on. So why the feeling of free will is a gift is because imagine if you suddenly felt like you couldn't move of your own volition. You really felt like you were a slave, like you were handcuffed, and you could only move when someone else moved you. They drag you and they say, eat now, stop eating now, come now. And everything in your life was according to someone else telling you what to do. That would feel terrible. We don't have that. We have the feeling that I am free to eat when I want to eat, to go to the toilet when I want to go to the toilet, to sit, to stand. So that's the gift, is the feeling of free will. Whether it's true that we are free autonomous entities is not so important. Let's say we are slaves, but we're lucky slaves, right? That we're slaves, but we feel like we're not slaves.
Okay. It's
So
like a big fantasy, a big comedy. I don't understand anymore. Completely confused.
So the significance is the distinction between the belief in personal doership, the belief I am the doer, versus the feeling of free will. Because often when we drop the...
Yeah, I understand. I understand, but it's like it's behind now. It's complete. Oh, everything is completely confused. I am consciousness, everything. I mixed everything.
Yeah, so drop it all. Relax. It's not important.
Why I'm here? What I'm doing here. So.
Yeah. That's it. See, if you have the realization, oh, I'm not the doer, and there's nothing to understand, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen, so I might as well be on the beach. It's a very deep realization.
But, could you repeat?
At some point after enough satsang, you get the message. It says, I'm not the one that drives this search. I'm not the one that has to understand anything. I'm not the one that is in control. All of my seeking from the thinking mind point of view, all of the thinking that says, I have to get it, I have to understand, why am I not getting it? All of that arises in the form of an uncomfortableness is the thinking mind. So when we realize, actually, I can just forget about this and go to the beach.
We do it.
Yeah. Then that's a deep realization of non-doership. That's not giving up in despair. That's surrender to the realization, I can't do this. I'm not the one leading the show. If I get up in the next moment and go to the beach, that's God's will. That's the story of life unfolding exactly as it's predetermined. And how it unfolds is through in each moment me doing exactly what I think or feel to do. So the feeling arises, I want to go to the beach. And you go to the beach. And if you realize that that feeling is God's will, and God's will manifests as the feeling of my free will to go to the beach. So then you say, well, if I feel like going to the beach, I'm going to go to the beach. I understand that that is God's will. And if it's God's will for enlightenment to happen, it damn well better happen on the beach.
But I don't understand, is the God will? No.
Well, God will just means not your will.
Yeah.
The notion of God's will is brought in to challenge the deeply ingrained belief that everything happens according to my will. My will as a separate, independent entity in control of everything I think, feel and do. Life is happening, moment after moment. If you surrender your control of life, the thinking mind assumes that life will turn into a horrible mess.
Mm.
If you surrender your control of life, what happens is life will flow perfectly smoothly. The body will continue to function biologically, hunger will continue to arise, and the body will move towards food.
I don't know.
Try it and you'll see. Someone says, well, if everything's predetermined, then I'm going to sit on the chair, that's it. I say, yeah, for as long as it's predetermined. And then a feeling of hunger will arise, and you go, this is stupid, I'm going in to get something to eat. That was predetermined. So whatever, if you surrender the control, the body will still move you through life. You don't need to get this. Relax. And when I say relax, it's not a prescription to someone. It's a description that in any moment relaxation can happen. If we're not in control, we can just relax and go, so you're off duty. No job to do. And if suffering is there in a particular moment, it's because you're not the one creating life. If you were the one creating life, then we would all ensure that our life was free of suffering. So if suffering is there, at some point, the realization, I'm not the one creating this. Let God created it, let God deal with it.
Yeah.
I'm going to the beach.
He does it for you. He does it for you.
So I'm not really sure what my question is on this, but in your example about being in the restaurant, that's quite clear. It's like you sit down, you have to make a decision. Or you could just not and something will happen. But life seems to flow that way. In the flow, you just go about your day and your decisions are made. It's quite clear. But then every so often, you have a so-called important decision to make, or there's a indecision, really. And that's really when the suffering comes in, because then the brain starts calculating what to do about this. And it might rank it as the most important thing in the world to solve. And then you're in trouble, because it might be days while you're churning through some conundrum. So, I mean, you could say, of course, there's free will in that choice as well, but really you're just under observation, of course. It's just a whole load of brain activity going on, and then eventually an answer comes one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, I mean, maybe you could talk to that. You could talk to about indecision when we have a important decision to make, because that's really when people have a problem with that. But then it does sometimes feel, well, I have to make a choice. But is that?
So that's a concept that we have that says, I have to make a choice now. It's the doership that feels it's in control of how life looks, how life unfolds. And it's the attachment to outcome in us. So this combination of doership and attachment to outcome. Attachment to outcome the deeply ingrained belief that my happiness, my completeness is to be found in life looking a particular way. So we get presented with a decision to make, and we're convinced that the outcome is relevant to my completeness, and so we feel like I better make the right decision. Otherwise, if I make the wrong decision, this is detrimental to my happiness, to my being. So the non-recognition that life is going to unfold as it's destined or as it's created, and the non-recognition that actually outcomes are not as important as our thinking mind imagines, means that there's a frustration with decisions sometimes. Now, that frustration is also part of the destined story of life, because there's no part of us that is functioning independent of the life experience. So if the frustration is there, then we can say the frustration is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning given the circumstance, based on our beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome, and hence the frustration is arising not because of my doing, but because of factors that came before. Or we can just say it's all of that is the story of life unfolding. And if life included a deep realization that life is happening, if I'm destined to feel indecisive about something and I miss the boat because of indecision, it was destined for that to happen. It was destined for life to unfold like that. And frankly, it's going to unfold that way if it's destined to unfold that way. And me missing the boat is not as significant as my thinking mind might have thought in the past. So Ramana has a great quote, which won't quote, I'll sort of paraphrase, something like, life unfolds according to the great ordainer, meaning it's a creation according to source. Life unfolds according to the great ordainer. It unfolds according to our body karma, some Indian word that escapes me, parabrahma, escapes me at the moment, meaning that that's a description of cause and effect, meaning that life unfolds according to the great ordainer, but it's because karma really means action and reaction. It's impersonal. So it means it unfolds according to apparent causality. And then it goes on to say that if something is destined to happen, it will happen no matter how great a force in the universe tries to make it not happen. And if something is destined not to happen, it will not happen no matter how great a force in the universe tries to make it happen. Basically saying everything will unfold exactly as it's destined to unfold. And so if we surrender to this and realize that this has always been the case, we've never been controlling life, we've only ever thought we were controlling life, and we've got this far in life as the we've thought we were the doer, but we realize I've never been the doer, life has always been happening. And so surrendering the belief in doership doesn't actually change how life has been happening since the beginning of time. Life has always been a happening, according to, in Ramana's quote, the great ordainer. And so surrendering the belief in personal doership doesn't suddenly mean that life is going to spiral negatively. It's going to continue happening according to destiny. And in fact, what happens is when life allows us to surrender our sense of personal doership, it tends to actually improve remarkably. Suffering falls away. And a body intelligence is allowed to function, and so outcomes tend to be better. Not infallibly better. If we think that I surrender my doership and then suddenly life is going to be brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. No, it means that we surrender our sense of doership and attachment to outcome, and life will be free of suffering, because suffering is based on the maintaining of those beliefs. Then we surrender the belief in doership, and an intelligence that previously wasn't free to function gets to function, and we find that actually life turns out to be overall more efficient.
So would you say that you've become more decisive and less indecisive?
I never really suffered from indecision. And so if someone is indecisive, this change in attitude isn't necessarily going to make them decisive. It's going to make them at peace with their indecision or with their indecisiveness. If the understanding which is based on, includes the falling away of the belief that my happiness is dependent on outcomes, it could well change how we relate to decisions. So Ramesh would say some people are calculated in how they make decisions. That includes me, and Ramesh also used to say he was calculated in how he makes a decision. It's just destiny functioning through his body-mind organism to look at something in a calculated way. He said, however, if he wasn't designed to look at decisions in a calculated way, he would toss a coin and be satisfied that he's not designed in a way that makes calculated decisions. He's designed in such a way that has been okay with the notion of tossing a coin because of the understanding that whatever comes up is God's will. Now, that doesn't mean that's the only two ways of doing it, but what he's pointing at is that how you make decisions is not so important, but rather it's your attitude to decisions that's important. Just like is in the case for all of our happiness is not about becoming an improved version of yourself, but rather accepting the version of yourself that you are. Accepting that life is unfolding as destined, and so if you happen to be indecisive, it's like that for a good reason. It's like that in order for life to turn out exactly the way it's meant to turn out.
Some days ago, we spoke about suffering arising because of the belief to be a person in time, or to be a doer in time, so like a double suffering. And I find it, I see from an intellectual point that every image of a past or future comes with suffering. But for me it's very difficult to drop the belief of time. So maybe you can speak a little bit about this now. And
was this my satsang you were in when we did all this, when this came up?
Yes, I don't understand.
Well, because I think you might be carrying over some concepts from other teaching paths, maybe. Because I definitely don't say that all thoughts to do with the past and future are suffering. It's the thoughts about the past and the future that are infused with the belief of doership and attachment to outcomes that are suffering. So we will always function in life as if time and space is real. A liberated person still has memory about what they did 5 minutes before, what they did a day before, and in some cases what they did 20 years before. And they will always function on the basis that there is a here and a there. So at some point when the urge to go to the bathroom arises, the liberated person gets up and moves towards where theoretically the bathroom is, over there. So it shows that there is the ingrained assumption in them that there is a here and a there, and it means that it will take time to get there. And so they function on the basis, even if they say, I don't believe in time, I don't believe in space, all that's an illusion. That's part of the teaching. At the end of the day, they function in life as if time and space is real. They will say to their wife, when the wife says, can you take the rubbish out? They'll say, I'll do it in half an hour. And so this notion about all thoughts of the past and future, including suffering, is not entirely as I would put it forward. Where the suffering of doership and time comes in is where memory of the past that exists in the present moment is a memory that includes an uncomfortableness with oneself or the other based on the event that happened in the past, and at the time the attitude to that event, our way of relating to what was happening, was one that created intense hatred or intense shame, and that gets locked away in the system. And so then we can have a thought that is based on time, based on regret in the past, let's say, or blame for something that happened in the past. And someone could say to you, a teaching could say, if you no longer believe in time, your suffering will fall away because you will remain now, and you'll see that in this moment, the event doesn't exist. Yeah. In this moment, I am, and I am complete. That's sort of accurate. I would rather say that once the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes is dissolved, and the energies that were locked away based on past experiences, which include this belief in doership and attachment, are dissolved, then we can still function as we're destined to function, which is as if the past existed, as if the future will exist. So when I see someone who I went to school with, I recognize them in the present moment. There is a recognition. And the recognition is based on the way life is put together, which is even for everyone, there is a memory of having gone to school with that person. And so once the doership has been dissolved and the attachment to outcome has been dissolved, I don't need to get rid of the idea of time. Because in practice, I see someone and the thought automatically arises, we went to school together 15 years ago. And so if someone suggests that now they don't believe in time and they don't think about the past, when they see someone that they recognize, that would mean that no thought arises that, I know you from school, and it's not accurate. So what they're saying is, I don't think about the past in a way that is loaded with attachment to outcomes and doership. That energy has fallen away. And so I don't find myself regretting what happened in the past. I don't find myself expecting the future to look a certain way. So even if I function and someone says, so where will you be in a month's time? And I'll say, in a month's time I'm going to be in whatever, India. I will say that based on a rough plan, knowing, or even if it was not a rough plan, even if it was a very exact plan with all the tickets bought and everything, I would say I'm going to be in India in a month without any attachment to outcome, meaning I understand that how things look in a month's time is not in my control. And so as long as I say that without an attachment to outcome, if in a month's time I find myself not in India, but in bed with a flu, then it's not a surprise to me. I know that this is just a concept, that I'll be in India in a month's time, and actually in a month's time, who knows? Oh, just to round off. Ramesh would sometimes like to pose questions that he thought people should ask. He's sort of like saying, this could be a good question to ask. And one of them was, so if, he'd say, so someone could ask me, if I recognize that all of life is completely predetermined, or at least I'm entertaining the notion that life is completely predetermined, how do I live my life? And he said, it's very simple. In each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do, knowing that that is what is destined to happen in that moment, with no regrets in the past, no expectations in the future, and no complaints in the present moment. Now that sounds like a prescription. Actually, it's a description about how life is lived when the belief in doership and attachment to outcomes falls away. And to me, it's a description of living happily. Not something that we can make happen. We will function that way if life changes our makeup in such a way that we can't help but function that way. And the way that we can't help functioning that way is when life changes our makeup such that the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome are dissolved, because they're seen to be based on an assessment of life that, when we investigate life closer and closer, we see is inaccurate. So that old basis that seemed to make sense is undermined, dissolves, and the functioning, the psychological functioning of suffering that blamed the other, felt guilt and pride, and was expecting life to look a certain way, falls away. So we end up then, in each moment, doing exactly what we think or feel to do. That's a description of how we're always functioning, which is this feeling of free will. Understanding that that action, which feels like my free will, is actually a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning that I had no control over. So in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do, knowing that what you're doing is what's destined to happen. Then, I left this out, then sit back and see what the outcome is, knowing that the outcome is not in your control. Sit back with no regrets in the past, no expectations in the future, and no complaints in the present.
Sounds easy.
When it is easy, it is easy. What he used to say is life is not easy, but with this understanding, it becomes very simple. You still might have to carry heavy loads up the hill day after day if your destiny is to not have enough money to buy food for yourself and your family. That doesn't make life easy. But with this understanding, it's very simple. There'll be the understanding it's my destiny to have to carry heavy loads up a hill day after day after day. And the attitude makes life simple. Nothing, no excessive thinking about why is this happening to me, this shouldn't happen to me, etc., etc.
So it can be really easy for the doer within to hear about the personal investigation of your own experience and to see that you are not the doer. And then there are other times that you can hear in a teaching like this, and as you mentioned before, that, just stop trying to understand and just relax, as a description of what can happen. I was wondering if you could just talk about the appropriateness of that being said. I know for me, at least, there's a deep inclination to keep trying to understand things. But then also hearing and experiencing times when nothing in particular was understood, and then something was understood.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if the thinking mind has clearly hijacked the pointers and is doing what it does, which is like the hamster in the hamster wheel, thinking it's getting somewhere, whereas in fact it's just getting tired, or a dog chasing its tail, thinking I'm getting closer to catching this thing that I need to catch, and it's actually not getting any closer, or like a person that's fallen into quicksand and is convinced that the more that they struggle, the more chance they are to have to get out, instead of realizing that the more you struggle, the more you sink. So when the thinking mind has hijacked the pointers, a teaching will recognize that, a teacher will recognize that, and say, actually, you don't have to do anything. Actually, just relax and surrender. That's the art of skillful means, which understands what is appropriate to be said in a particular moment, what concept, what words deals with the issue at hand. And at other times, instead of just saying there's nothing to do, just relax, at other times concepts are delivered that are speaking to the working mind, not the thinking mind. And when the working mind is conditioned because of the instruction, which is not an instruction, it's just new conditioning. So when the working mind gets reconditioned, i.e. receives new conditioning and the up-to-date conditioning changes, then the working mind might start automatically functioning in the course of daily living without having turned it into objective and a practice. It starts to function automatically because something that was referenced gets seen, and as a result of seeing it, automatically a continuation of the chain of action and reaction happens. So if I were to put forward the description of what a personal investigation of your own looks like. So these are in the words of Ramesh. Say, at the end of the day, sit quietly, turn off your phone, close the door. You don't have to sit in a special position. You can even have a coffee or a beer or a brandy if you like. This is not about some rigorous exercise or some special posture. And you take one activity that you are convinced is your doing, one activity that amongst all others you're not sure, but this one I'm sure is my doing, and you investigate it. And you'll find time and time again that this action that you are convinced is your action happened because you saw something, smelt something, tasted something, touched something, or heard something in the environment you were in the circumstance you were in. And you'll realize that what you saw, smelt, tasted, etc. was not in your control. Let's say someone came running past you and you saw them and you weren't in control of the circumstance you were in. You weren't in control of them running past you. And as a result of seeing them, according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning that you're not in control of, a thought arose. That guy's got my computer. And as a result of that, you pick up a gun and you shoot him. That's my doing. I'm convinced it was my doing. I shot him. But on the investigation, the shooting happened. I just decided to use an extreme example today. Shorten the whole thing. The shooting that I'm convinced is my doing gets seen to be actually a continuation of a series of cause and effect that started way, way back. In this investigation, we say we were sitting quietly and then I saw something that I wasn't in control of. And as a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning and the circumstance, a thought arose. That's my computer. And then that thought turned into a subsequent action based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. Gun, shoot him. You know, if you had different genes and up-to-date conditioning, or the circumstance was different, the outcome would be different. So it's pointing at the fact that what we think was my own independent outcome is a result of a thought that arose based on factors that I'm not in control of, my genes and up-to-date conditioning, and that thought then led to an action which is also based on genes and up-to-date conditioning. So that's a description that is given as simply new conditioning. Everything in the talks is just new conditioning. It may or may not become part of your up-to-date conditioning. And at some point, you might have the thought that arises that says, I want to do this personal investigation today. And if that thought arises, it's a result of having heard about the personal investigation of your own. And so at some point, without you knowing when that's going to be, the thought arises, I'm going to do it, which will then possibly lead to you going and sitting quietly in a room. It may not. You may have the thought, and then your phone rings, and you find yourself going off in some other direction. If you find yourself sitting quietly in a room, then you might find yourself picking one action in the day that you're convinced is your doing, and on it goes. Now, if that happens in a way that is not contrived, and you just find that it's what you feel like doing, then you can say, oh, what I feel like doing is based on my up-to-date conditioning, which included hearing this description. And then we see that at a different point in the teaching, it's relevant to give some descriptions of what the working mind might end up using. Whereas at another point in the teaching, it's worth saying, look, actually just relax. Everything is taken care of. You don't need to do anything. And they're both dealing with different issues. If all we gave was the notion relax, and life never delivered anything more than relax, we might find that we get given that notion, but it can never happen. It can never happen because the deeply ingrained beliefs of doership are in place and attachment to outcome, and that will prevent a relaxing. And luckily, life gives us more than just telling us to relax. Not that relax is not a relevant pointer. And at certain points, the thought, I just have to relax. I don't have to make this happen. The working mind worked hard on its own for the first 2 hours of the day, and now it's turned into the thinking mind, trying to make things happen quicker than is destined. Let me just relax. Stop. And we stop and we find ourselves, that's better.